At this time, I will hand it over to our opening presenter, Kelly Wilson.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to share the presentation with you, hopefully in a second here. Well, as Kenny said, I'm the Financial Services Manager for the Financial Services Program team, and we are responsible for administering the cost share program. The purpose of the cost share program is for Modot to partner with external parties to share in the cost of a road and/or bridge project on Modot's system. So today we will discuss how the cost share program is funded, how the cost share program funds can be applied to a project, what projects and costs are eligible for the cost share program, and ways to make the application process smoother. Each year, Modot prepares a financial forecast in which we estimate the revenues coming in and the cost going out. So our salaries and benefits, our salt, mowing, fleet equipment, and as part of that financial forecast, we determine the amount that is available for the State Transportation Improvement Program, or STIP. And that STIP amount is run through the commission-approved funding distribution formula. So within that formula, an amount is set aside each year for the cost share program. So you'll notice that amount has been increasing each year. In 2022, that amount was $35 million. In 2024 and beyond, the cost share amount is $45 million. And just like the STIP, 100% of the cost share funding is available for distribution in the first 3 years, and only 50% is available for distribution in the last 2 years. So of that cost share amount, Modot sets aside an amount for projects that demonstrate economic development. And we'll define that a little bit later. But just so you know, prior to 2024, we set aside 10% of the cost share funds for projects that demonstrate economic development. And that increased to 20% starting in 2024. I think it's important to note, and I think there's a lot of confusion out there, that economic development funds are Modot funds. They are not funds that are provided by another entity or an external party. These are funds that we choose to set aside to promote economic development projects. So just to give you an idea of the funding that's available currently in the cost share program, we have broken out the funding that is available for just regular cost share projects, and then the funding that is available for economic development projects. And you'll notice that in the first 2 years, 2022 and 2023, there are no just regular cost share funds available. That's because they have been fully awarded or distributed to projects. But you'll notice that there are economic development set-aside funds available in all 5 years. I also want to draw your attention to 2025 and 2026 funding. This funding reflects that 50% of the total cost share funds. So in July, with the approval of the STIP, that 2025 amount will double and reflect our full $45 million. So Modot will fund up to 50% of the total project cost unless a project can demonstrate economic development and applies for the economic development set-aside funds. In that case, Modot will fund up to 100% of the total project cost. Now, to demonstrate economic development, a project must create jobs. And this does not include retail development. Modot partners with the Missouri Department of Economic Development to determine if a project creates jobs. Something important to note is that Modot's share of the project, whether that be 50% or some other percentage, is comprised of not only the cost share funds and the economic development set-aside funds, but it's also comprised of any operating budget costs that we incur for the project. So this could be Modot's, internal PE, CE, or right-of-way cost, as well as any STIP budget funds that a district commits to a project. So in total, all of those costs, no matter what source they come from, cannot exceed the amount that Modot will participate in. That becomes part of Modot's share. In addition, according to the project guidelines, the applicant is responsible for all cost overruns. So in simple terms, what that means is if a project is awarded at a total project cost of $1 million and the actual costs come in at $1.5 million, the applicant is responsible for that additional $500,000. Now, an applicant can bring multiple sources of funding to a project. And sometimes, we have applicants that are either allocated or awarded federal funds for a specific project. In that case, the applicant must provide the cash match for any federal funds they bring to a project. Modot will not provide the match for the applicant's federal funds. So an example of that would be if an applicant's share of the project is $100,000, they cannot bring $100,000 of federal funds to the project. They would have to bring the required cash match for those federal funds. And if so, for example, if the required match was 20%, then the applicant could provide $80,000 of federal funds for the project, for their share of the project, and $20,000 must be cash. So to be eligible for the cost share program funds, a project must be a road and or bridge project on the state system, and the total project cost must exceed $200,000. So total project costs include any and all costs for planning, acquisition, development, so engineering, and construction of the project. It is important to note that each project is limited to $10 million of cost share or economic development set-aside funds and limited to $2.5 million of cost share funds in each year. So a project can be awarded up to $10 million, but recognize not that full $10 million would not be available in 1 year, but rather it'd be available over multiple years. Now, an applicant can seek an exception to these two limitations, but this must be requested and approved prior to the application deadline. So the applicant should be having conversations with the district and financial services prior to the application deadline to get that approval. Lastly, a project application must be submitted by the application deadline. If an application is not submitted by the deadline, the project will be considered in the next meeting. And just a heads up, the next meeting is in June and the application deadline is April 18th. So each project application must be submitted with the following letters of support. And the goal of these letters of support is to make sure that the project is compatible with the transportation goals of that region. So the first letter I want to draw your attention to is the Modot District Engineer support letter. The applicant really needs to be working with the district in ensuring that the district engineer and the district support the application and that project. This ensures that the project meets the goals of not only Modot, but that particular district. And again, the applicant should really be working with the district several months ahead of the application deadline to ensure that the DE supports the project. And they should be receiving that letter of support so they can submit it with the application. The second required letter of support is from the applicable Metropolitan Planning Organization or Regional Planning Commission. And again, the applicant should be working with these organizations prior to the application deadline to receive a letter of support. And this just ensures that the project is compatible with the region's transportation goals. The last letter of support is not required for all projects, but only required when a project is requesting economic development set-aside funds. And this is a letter of support from the Missouri Department of Economic Development. The applicant must work with the applicable Department of Economic Development regional engagement contact to get their support of the project. And in this letter, the Department of Economic Development will confirm the anticipated number of jobs that will be created by the project. And as you can see, we've included a link to this map and the contact list so that you would have that link as those contacts change. You can always check that website. So per the cost share guidelines, projects that significantly expand the state highway system or increase maintenance costs for Modot must have pre-approval by the deputy director prior to the submittal of the application. So districts will need to contact the deputy director to seek this pre-approval. Now, as the districts have this conversation with the deputy director, the one thing they need to determine is, will Modot require an offset for these increased costs for this expanded system? And there's two ways that we can require an offset. And the first is that the applicant accept transfer of ownership of a portion of roadway that Modot currently owns. Or two, that the applicant pay Modot for all increased maintenance costs. So all applications that are submitted for each cost share meeting are prioritized based on the transportation need that the project meets, the public benefit and economic development benefit or economic development that it promotes, and the applicant's share of the total project costs. So as you're writing support letters, as you're reviewing projects, recognize that these are the criteria that the cost share staff review team will be using as they prioritize projects. And just recognize cost share funds are awarded to the projects based on their priority. So higher priority projects are considered for funds before lower priority projects. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, projects are reviewed and prioritized by the cost share staff review team. So the cost share staff review team is comprised of the following divisions: design, transportation planning, highway safety and traffic, chief counsel's office, and financial services, as well as the Missouri Department of Economic Development. And the cost share staff review team reviews these projects, and they determine whether a project will be submitted to the cost share committee for approval based on the cost share guidelines that are established. So once reviewed and prioritized, the projects are submitted to the cost share committee. The cost share committee is comprised of the deputy director, chief financial officer, assistant chief engineer, and 2 members selected by the director. Currently, those 2 members are the governmental relations director and the chief administrative officer. Now, projects are presented by the district to the cost share committee at each meeting. And oftentimes the area engineers present the projects, but it's at the district's discretion to determine who will present the projects. Once projects are approved by the cost share committee, they're required to have approval by the Missouri Highways and Transportation Commission. Now, projects that are receiving or being awarded economic development set-aside funds must be approved by the commission individually. So we create a commission item that the commission approves that specific project. But for all projects receiving cost share funds, whether it be regular cost share funds or economic development set-aside funds, every project has to be approved by the commission through the STIP. So either through a STIP amendment or through the annual update. So once approved, the district is responsible for drafting the cost share agreement and providing that agreement to the applicant for execution. So per the cost share guidelines, the applicant must execute the agreement within 6 months of the award. So for regular cost share funds, the award is when the cost share committee approved the project. For economic development set-aside funds, that 6-month deadline or that 6-month time frame starts when the commission approves the project. as the district drafts the agreements, it should be, sure to take into account the applicant's execution process and how long that process takes. Really, the earlier you start drafting the cost share agreement, the better. So I just want to draw your attention to some ways to make an application move through the process a little smoother. Our partner, and this really comes down to our applicants or our partners, they really need to be working with the district long before the application deadline. They need to provide the district with the project scope, limits, and estimates so that the districts have sufficient time to review these projects and ensure that they meet the intent of the cost share program, and that the project meets the district's transportation needs or goals. And lastly, we really need those applicants to be submitting the estimates and project scope and limits to the districts early, because we are seeing that a lot of projects are wanting to come back for additional cost share funds or additional STIP budget funds. And really, our guidelines are very clear that the entity or the applicant is responsible for cost overruns. And so we really need to give our districts time, and the applicants need to give our districts time to review these estimates, to vet these estimates, and ensure that they are reasonable. Because every time we have to bring a project back to the cost share committee, it's creating extra work on the district, it's creating extra work on the cost share staff review team, as well as the cost share committee. And our goal is really to hold to the cost share guidelines and make the applicant responsible for the overruns. Now, sometimes when a project is approved for cost share or economic development set aside funds, those funds are not available in the year that the applicant is requesting the funds or needing the funds. And there are two options basically when this happens to offset this difference in the request versus when the funds are available. The first is that the applicant can accelerate the funds, the cost share funds. And this just means that the applicant funds the project costs and receives reimbursement at a later date when those cost share or economic development set aside funds are available. Now, the applicant can fund the project with its own source of funds, whether they have their own cash or federal funds or whatever that might be, or they can seek an MTFC loan or a SIB loan, which Sunny is going to talk about later. The other option is that the applicant can delay the project schedule to match up with the availability of the cost share or economic development set aside funds. Now, often what you will see, if you are one of the lucky people who gets asked a lot of questions about cost share, you're often going to see that the cost share staff review team will ask how an applicant will fund a project if the cost share economic development funds are not available in the year they requested. So it'll be a good idea to have a conversation with your applicant prior to getting asked that question, just to be prepared, because it will come up on every project. So lastly, I just want to draw your attention to the partnership development webpage. So this is out there, it's an external page, and it has all the cost share guidelines as well as cost share deadlines. And it also has contact information, which we provided here below. We have several employees who work on our cost share program. And so an overarching email that you can get a hold of any of us is at partnership.development@modot.mo.gov, or feel free to call the number on the screen. And Kenny, I'll turn it back over to you for the question and answers.
All right. Thank you, Kelly. That was a great presentation. At this time, we will take questions. We will start by reading the questions in the question and answer pod, and then we'll open the floor for verbal questions. If you are wanting to ask a verbal question, just please use the raise your hand tool that's in WebEx, and we'll get to you once we complete the written questions. So, all right, we do have one question in the pod right now. It looks like It's from Laura Ellen, and it says, an LPA recently asked if Modot is considering increasing the cost share amount to help with the recent increase in project costs, so the LPA is not responsible for all additional cost. This is related to kind of the inflationary increases that we've seen recently.
Yes, so there has been no talk of that at this time, but I do think that kind of comes back to the estimate. And I know we're kind of in unprecedented times right now where we're seeing these large amounts of inflation. But I really think that kind of comes back to, these estimates. And I know now we won't be able to address the inflation that's happening now, but in the future, as we look at these projects, reasonable inflation we ought to be able to address. And that's where we really need to vet those estimates as we go through the process.
All right, thank you, Kelly. Another question is, if a project is not entirely on the state system, can it be temporarily brought into the system?
The simple answer is yes, but recognize that this needs to be reasonable. We don't want to be bringing things into our system, right, that we're improving and we're putting cost on that we are then just going to turn back to the applicant. So there are times that it makes sense, though, that we need to bring something into our system to make the project flow, right, or connect correctly to the applicant's roadways or whatever else is out there.
So it would have to be connected to the state system for that to occur, correct?
Correct.
On the pod here, for a significant expansion project requiring offset by paying increased maintenance costs, how far into the future does that calculation extend?
So currently we don't have that defined in the cost share guidelines. And so we do leave that to the district's discretion, as well as, as we leave that to the district's discretion to calculate. And I think something to just really consider as in the district, you recognize any time that we commit to funding increased maintenance costs or the increased maintenance costs related to expansion, is that this is a long term. This is something that Modot will have to maintain, and can we meet our asset management goals when we're expanding the system and that kind of thing. So that's just at this point, simple answer is we leave that at the discretion of the district, but the district really should be thinking long term. What are we committing Modot to in the future?
And this is Sunny. The other thing I would like to offer on that too is not only, we leave it to the district's discretion, like Kelly said, but know that the cost share committee will typically ask those kind of questions. So if it's debatable about whether it's significant, that's probably a good point for the district to have that conversation then with the deputy director to make sure that he's concurring and that he understands and he's kind of on the same page. Because that may be questioned then in the cost share committee meeting and could basically potentially hold up this project getting full approval or maybe being contingent upon further discussion.
So I think that's a good point by both of you all. I think it's important that we have these conversations early because we do have that cost share committee meeting just on a regular basis, but not very often. So you want to have all the answers or all the anticipated questions resolved before you get to that meeting so that you don't get delayed to the next quarter.